On this channel, we have covered in detail the histories of Iridea and some of the Age of Runes, when the stone giants gifted mortals magic and metal. Today, however, we'll cover a high-level overview of Telor's first ages, the Veliric Era. Telor's civilization truly began when the first elves came to the Elder Lands from a mystical doorway known as the Horizon Gate, of which next to nothing is known. There were 49 ships which led them there, and from those early outposts and expeditions was founded the first city on Telor, Maroon Door of the Alabaster Falls. Its founder was the first king, Elokir the Starfinder. From these early kingdoms would emerge the Pharenic Empire, and thus define the age as the Pharenic Age and begin written history at year 0. Telor's history is divided into eras, each with its own ages, and the Pharenic Age was the first age of the Veliric Era, which translates to the era of the first elves, as elves were the dominant species to herald civilization in its current form. The Pharenic Age would be defined with the complex alliances and wars dealt with the other wildmen and stone-helm humans of the continent, which would lead to the first wars, and thus the shedding of blood would become a cornerstone of Teloran history from henceforth. The Pharenic Empire would establish many colonies, the greatest of which would break off and become the Aegir cities, a united federation of 12 city-states which inhabited the uncountable islands of what is now called the Aeaean Seas. These times would also be defined by brass and bronze, with great cities of marble built upon the very foundations of Telor, the black-hewn obelisks which dot the landscape. Other colonies included the Holdrast, who were named after a Stonehelm word. This was so as the kingdom was founded upon a union of humanity and elf, which led to the first half-elves and first kingdoms west of the Icespires in what are now the Borderlands. The Holdrast ruled as a diarchy, much like the two kings of ancient Greece. There would be one human king and one elven king, each governing their own peoples within the land. The Holdrast's ruins are still seen today, and their culture is known for its focus on the stars as the spirits of one's ancestors and the rivers as the blood vessels of the world. Their views of the world being a sentient thing, which has to be cared for, would eventually grow into the Pullic and Druidic belief system of animism. Another notable kingdom is the Hodraki, a human land inhabiting the frigid wilds of the far north. The Hodraki are believed to be the ancestors of the Skalviir and Aeaeans, and those languages are descended from the Hodraki tongue. The Hodraki were said to file their teeth into points and wear the skins of animals to shapeshift into such creatures. Some superstitious folk even believe that the first Wergir, or werewolves, came from the Hodraki's abuse of their skin-changing powers. The last cornerstone of the Pharenic Age would be the rise of the Shadow, the penumbral entities known only as the Nameless Ones, for they are devoid of body, name, and morality, wishing for all things to know the loneliness of being forgotten and forlorn of being nameless. In the beginning, 33 Nameless Ones there were, each embodying some primal terrible or abhorrent thing which existed, such as famine, war, despair, and wrath. The numerous smaller kingdoms and empires of the elves would form the Starsteel Pact, a holy alliance which sought out to vanquish the Nameless Ones and stop them before they could achieve their vile purpose. Countless lives were lost in the following Starsteel Wars, and it was said by the scrolls that all stars were blotted out and a great sundering broke the many empires of Telor. However, with the cost being Elokir's life and the hope of his son Elodan, the Nameless Ones were vanquished to a separate prison plane and permanently shut from the material world. According to some, the legendary Swords of Fate were forged with bark from the Tree of Destiny and threads of fate to combat the Nameless Ones if they were ever to return. This ended the Pharenic Empire and thus the Pharenic Age. Next would begin the Eterian Age after a short Dark Age, a time not of broken horizons and new lands, but rather of finally learning the ways of Telor and forming complex civilizations and commerce. Now the other kingdoms and city-states would not live under the shadow of the mighty Pharenic Empire. The Aegir elves of the aforementioned Aegir cities would travel across all of Arnowin and charter a large portion of the Western Hemisphere. They would build great citadels of silver and gold hewn, and build one of the greatest armadas the world has yet seen. This new age would bring about a time of prosperity to the elves, as they would come to inhabit all of Telor alongside their mannish and dwarven neighbours. The Morannon Empire, a military oligarchy, would spring up around the volcanic ashlands of Ashel, and the region would come to be named after the Morannon's founder, a cousin of Elokir, Helanakir Shelan the Elder. The Morannon would establish their own colonies. However, their stern and harsh rulership would lead to many breaking off. These former colonies would be forced from their lands by the very Morannon who founded them as retribution for revolt. The foremost of these colonies, Askur, would be forced down the Relkar Channel and would settle in eastern and northern Taramir. The Ascordif ruins are still present today with their Phoenician-styled architecture of our world. The fine stonework and carvings enduring is a testament to the elves' craftsmanship. As these colonies would be established and break off, and an age of enlightenment would come to all elves, humanity would also find their first success. After many years of living in the fey creatures' shadows, the men of Helm managed to throw the elven holdfasts and armies back into the sea from whence they came. Finally, they declared all lands of Helm to be ancestral holdings of man. These early conquests would define the Helm folk's perseverance and hard-working demeanour for the millennia to come. The Holdrast would cling on to life after the Starsteel Wars, and would grow into an empire as they conquered all of Western Telor, cementing themselves as one of the greats alongside the Morannon and Aegir lands. The Holdrast emperors would constantly be overthrown, assassinated, and deceived by one other of the Elven or human royal families. This changing of hands so often would lead to the Holdrast downfall. However, their name lives on in the Holdrast Mountains, which branch off from the Ice Spires. This golden era would not last, however, as a cult grew around the vanquished Nameless Ones and their patron Nyar, Hraktos the Worldbreaker. It is said that when Tork and Mashanael realized their follies and made peace, nullifying their power in the process, Hraktos was enraged at the weakness of his master, and so he continued the fight against Telor, so that all of it may be blanketed in ash and shadow. The Cult of Endings would eventually find the precise location where the Nameless Ones were sealed away, and with cunning temporal magics of unearthly power broke their prison. The remaining Nameless Ones were unleashed upon an unprepared Telor, and the Morannon and Aegir empires were said to have fallen within 50 years. The Nameless One, known only as Desolation, erupted the volcano within Ashel, Shimbarfa, which ruined all lands north and east of it, poisoning the seas of Emia. This taint would be carried by ocean currents south, and soon all the waters of Telor grew blackened and venomous to drink or wash. The age of Shadowfall had begun, and the last great golden age of the elves had ended. The following years are not well documented. However, it is known that a great wall was built to fight off the godless monsters coming from the north. The far north and the seas of Emia had fallen to the Nameless Ones, and their mortal inhabitants were slain or forced to work the forges of war. The great Nightguard wall would hold fast for 70 years, and during this time an alliance had been struck between the mortals of Telor. The dwarves were taught the ways of metallurgy, men were secured free passage and holdings across the continent, and finally the elves were given sanctum in the Elder Lands if all other elven nations were to fall. At last, the continental siege ended when the great coalition of all peoples organized an amphibious assault upon the main domain of the Nameless Ones, the volcano of Shimbarfa. The following Battle of Falling Stars is still recounted in myth and legend alike. The details, heroics, tragedies and triumphs of those times is beyond the scope of this video, though it will be briefly detailed. First, they sailed up the Shanris River, where they made landing at the dead Morannan capital of Ulgric. The dwarven mountain armies secured barricades and siege equipment, while the iron blades and arrows of the elves soaked the foothills of Shimbarfa with the black blood of evil. Humanity led their relentless charge directly against the dark holdfast from which the Nameless Ones held their power. With all of man's courage and perseverance which defined its early years shining through. At last the Nameless One of Darkness was struck down by the dwarf Hasserfeld, and the chains of Adana, alongside the swords of fate, were used to slay the remaining Nameless Ones, casting them into whatever frozen hell awaited them in the other world. Finally, the might of the Shadow was broken, and the age of Shadowfall ended. However, the cost was greater than none could possibly imagine. What followed was later named the Twilight Age, and was the last age of the Veliric Era where elves ruled. It was a slow withering, as the elder magics and fey wonder wilted and retreated to the old corners of the continent. At this stage, elven blood had intermingled with many other peoples, meaning that magical prowess was not excluded to the fey blood of the elves. The first true human magics was blood magic, which used life and especially blood as a conduit to channel arcane energy, and the next to come was thaumaturgy, which began to use magic not as a tool, but as a lens for which to examine science and the natural world. These new arts would allow humanity and dwarven kind to venture both deep into the mountains and to the farthest corners of the map, where they found strange peoples and stranger creatures. The elves, meanwhile, saw their decline, and shook, for they realized that their time was gone. They had left the Horizon Gate to prosper in new lands, not to conquer, as it was not their way. So, the last elven kingdoms and empires retreated into the Elder Lands, where they forsook all holdings outside of the region. If they were to maintain their iron grip over Telor, much blood, both fey and mortal, would have to be shed, and in the end, none had the fight left to do so after the age of Shadowfall. Now the world was old, and many ancient cities dotted the continent. Cultures and kingdoms of all peoples had founded and abandoned holdfasts and towns countless times, and the men and dwarves were developing their own technologies and their own practices. This was a time also of waning magic. Arcanum, the primordial force/dimension where all magical power was drawn, was becoming more distant, and the barrier between it and Telor was widening year by year. Even with the new human magics, monsters and wonders alike began to vanish, the greatest of which were the mighty sphinxes and the last faberworms, which would not emerge again for millennia. Culture and religion around this time would appear Persian or Byzantine-like to our eyes, with walls of iron and stone holding off borders, and mighty palaces of brass and gold. There were 12 human nations and 7 dwarven holdings, which were relatively close together and politically complicated, as all lands of Ashela and Emir were still cloaked in ruin and ash after Shadowfall. Countless petty skirmishes, wars, short alliances, and ever-changing borders would define this part and this final ending of the Veliric Era. The Twilight Age and the whole of the Veliric Era as a whole would end with fire. Even after so many disasters, the mortals of Telor were unprepared for a series of massive eruptions from Shimbarfa as the volcano spewed and fumed. A 21-year-long winter covered the continent, and much of Arnuen itself, where widespread famine and mutterings of displeased gods consumed Telor. Bandits and a brutal ecosystem of survival of the fittest became the common law. All civilizations fell within decades, and humanity and dwarf kind were set back hundreds of years. Many arts and knowledge would be lost, and the elves would never again be the dominant beings on Telor. What came next was the era of legends, named so as most myths of modern religions and belief systems are meant to take place in this era, and many actual legends do too. It is a time of the rise of man and dwarf, of dragon slayers and epic heroes, of wild frontiers and exploring the ruins of old. That era is for another video, however. Hello, and thank you very, very much for watching. This one has been a bit of a slog to get through due to many images, but it was also one of the most fun videos to make for me. This is the first kind of overview of Telor's history, which I'll do. I will also do one for the era of legends at some point in the future. Probably not the next video or even the video after that. All for this one, all the artwork was made by me, which is why I do not give any credits for anyone. And I think that's all. Again, thank you for all the support recently. We recently pushed past 250 subscribers, and that's insane. That's a small town, I believe, if we're going by medieval standards. And yeah, thanks for watching. That's all.